He's my roommate.
Does the roommate still share your bed?
The words hit me like a slap across the face in front of 30 people at the Riverside Country Club's marble-floored ballroom. "Oh, this is Eddie, my roommate," Mara said with a laugh that sounded like breaking glass, her manicured hand dismissively waving in my direction. "Since I'm basically single again." Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible Reddit stories. I stood there in my best suit, the navy one she'd picked out for me 2 years ago, watching my wife of 8 years introduce me to her corporate friends like I was some college kid crashing on her couch. The chandeliers above cast everything in golden light, making the whole scene feel like a twisted fairy tale where the prince gets demoted to court jester. My name is Eddie Forrest, and until that moment, I thought I knew exactly who I was. 42 years old, owner of Forrest Construction, the guy who'd built half the custom homes in this Maine town with my own hands, the man who'd worked 16-hour days to pay for Mara's MBA, who'd renovated our Victorian house room by room, who'd loved a woman who apparently saw me as nothing more than someone who split the electric bill. Roommate? The word came out of my mouth before I could stop it, my voice carrying that edge that happens when you're trying not to lose your mind in public. "That's interesting, Mara. Does your roommate still share your bed? Or should I start looking for my own place?" The conversation around us died like someone had unplugged a stereo. Sienna Walsh, Mara's best friend since college, let out a nervous giggle. Julia Chen from Mara's office at TechFlow Solutions nearly choked on her wine. But it was the smug smile on Lance Bishop's face that made my hands clench into fists. Lance Bishop, wealth management consultant, the kind of guy who wore Italian shoes that cost more than most people's rent and drove a BMW that he parked across 2 spaces. I'd met him exactly 3 times at company events, and each time he'd looked at me like I was something stuck to his shoe. "Eddie's being dramatic," Mara said, her voice taking on that tone she used when she was trying to control a situation. She was beautiful. I'd never denied that. 5'6", auburn hair that caught light like fire, green eyes that could make you forget your own name. Tonight she wore a black dress that probably cost more than my truck payment, and she moved through the crowd like she owned the place. Maybe she thought she did. "I'm being accurate," I replied, my voice steady despite the storm building in my chest. "Roommates don't usually promise to love, honor, and cherish each other for life. But hey, maybe I missed that clause in our lease agreement." Lance stepped closer, and I caught a whiff of his cologne, something expensive that smelled like it came with its own trust fund. "Maybe you should take this conversation somewhere private," he suggested, his tone carrying the kind of authority that came from never having to worry about mortgage payments. "Maybe you should mind your own business," I shot back, and I saw something flicker in his eyes. Recognition, maybe, or guilt. The pieces were starting to fall into place, and I didn't like the picture they were forming. Mara's face had gone pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. "Eddie, please, you're embarrassing yourself." "No," I said, my voice getting quieter, which anyone who knew me would recognize as a bad sign. "I'm embarrassing you. There's a difference." I looked around the room at the faces staring back at me. These were Mara's people. Tech executives, marketing directors, consultants who made their living moving money around without ever building anything real. They lived in a world of quarterly reports and networking events where relationships were transactions and loyalty was a line item on a budget. I didn't belong here. I never had. "You know what?" I said, pulling my keys from my pocket. "Since you're single again, I guess you can find your own way home. Roommates don't usually provide taxi service." The sound of my footsteps on the marble floor seemed to echo forever as I walked toward the exit. Behind me, I could hear the murmur of voices starting up again, the gossip machine already grinding into motion. By tomorrow, everyone in town would know that Eddie Forrest had been publicly humiliated by his wife at the country club. But as I pushed through the heavy oak doors and stepped into the cool Maine evening, I realized something that made me smile for the first time in months. They had no idea what was coming. I spent that night in my workshop, surrounded by the tools that had built my business and the sawdust that had paid for Mara's designer lifestyle. The basement of our Victorian house had been my sanctuary for years, a place where everything made sense, where problems had solutions, and where the only politics involved figuring out which drill bit to use. My phone buzzed constantly. Text after text from Mara, starting angry, then confused, then worried, then angry again. I read them all and answered none. "Eddie, what the hell is wrong with you? I was just joking around. You know how I get at these things. Lance gave me a ride home. Your car wasn't here. We need to talk." "I'm serious, Eddie. Call me back." The car wasn't there because I'd taken it. My truck was in the shop, and I'd driven her precious Lexus to the country club. Let her figure out how to get around without me for a while. Let her ask Lance for more favors. By 3 a.m, I'd finished sanding the cabinet doors I'd been working on for the Peterson job and started asking myself the questions I'd been avoiding for months. When had Mara started working late so often? When had she stopped talking about her day? When had she started dressing like she was going to a job interview every time she left the house? I went upstairs and stood in the doorway of our bedroom, watching her sleep. Even in the dark, I could see her phone charging on the nightstand, the screen lighting up every few minutes with notifications. Mara had always been a heavy sleeper, a trait that had annoyed me when she'd sleep through thunderstorms but served me well now. Her phone wasn't password protected. We'd always trusted each other that much, or at least I thought we had. The recent messages were mostly from Sienna and Julia, rehashing the evening's drama. But when I scrolled back further, I found what I was looking for. Lance. Dozens of messages going back months. "Can't wait to see you Thursday. That restaurant you picked was perfect, very discreet. Eddie doesn't deserve you. When are you going to tell him?" My hands were shaking by the time I reached the photos. Nothing explicit, but intimate enough. Mara laughing over dinner at a restaurant I'd never been to. Lance's arm around her at some rooftop bar in Portland. The two of them in what looked like a hotel room, both fully clothed, but the implications clear enough. I took pictures of everything with my own phone, my construction worker hands surprisingly steady as I documented the end of my marriage. Then I put her phone back exactly where I'd found it and went back downstairs. The workshop had always been my thinking place, but tonight it felt different. Tonight it felt like a war room. I made coffee and started making lists. Everything I knew, everything I suspected, everything I needed to find out. Mara worked in HR at TechFlow Solutions, a company that had grown from a startup to a regional player in 5 years. She made good money, but not enough to afford the lifestyle she'd been living lately. The designer clothes, the expensive dinners, the weekend trips to Boston she claimed were for professional development. Lance Bishop worked for Pinnacle Wealth Management, handling accounts for TechFlow's executives. He drove a BMW 540i, lived in a downtown loft that probably cost $3,000 a month, and wore watches that cost more than most people's cars. He was everything I wasn't: smooth, sophisticated, rich enough to never worry about money, and apparently he was sleeping with my wife. By sunrise, I had a plan. The first step was information. I needed to know how deep this went, how long it had been going on, and who else knew about it. In a town like Millfield, secrets were hard to keep, but they were easy to find if you knew where to look. Rita's Tavern opened at 11, and Rita Morrison had been serving drinks and collecting gossip for 25 years. If anyone knew what was really going on, it would be her. I showered, shaved, and put on clean work clothes. When I came back upstairs, Mara was in the kitchen, still in her robe, looking like she'd aged 5 years overnight. "Eddie, we need to talk," she said without looking up from her coffee. "Good morning to you too, roommate. I replied, grabbing my travel mug and filling it from the pot she'd made. Sleep well? Don't start with that again. Last night was just... I don't know what got into me. I was nervous, and when I get nervous, I say stupid things. I leaned against the counter and studied her face. Even without makeup, even with her hair messy and her eyes red from crying, she was still beautiful. But now I could see things I'd missed before. The way she wouldn't meet my eyes, the way her hands shook slightly as she lifted her cup, the way she kept glancing at her phone. Nervous about what? I asked. It was just a work party. You've been to 100 of them. This one was different. There were some important people there, potential clients. I needed to make a good impression. And introducing your husband as your roommate made a good impression? She finally looked at me, and for a second I saw something that might have been regret. I'm sorry, Eddie, I really am. I don't know why I said that. I nodded and headed for the door. I'm sure you'll figure it out. Where are you going? To work. Some of us still have jobs to do. I left her standing in the kitchen, and I didn't look back. Rita's Tavern sat on the corner of Maine and Mill Streets, a brick building that had been serving the working class of Millfield since 1952. It wasn't the kind of place where tech flow executives usually drank, but it was exactly the kind of place where people talked about them. Rita Morrison was 55, built like a linebacker, and had a memory like a steel trap. She'd seen 3 husbands come and go, raised 2 kids on her own, and could spot trouble from across a crowded room. When I walked in at noon, she was already waiting for me. Eddie Forrest, she said, not looking up from the glass she was polishing. Figured I'd be seeing you today. News travels fast. Honey, in this town, news travels at the speed of light. Coffee or something stronger? Coffee's fine. It's been a long morning. She poured from a pot that looked like it had been brewing since the Carter administration and slid the cup across the bar. Heard your wife introduced you as her roommate last night at the country club. Among other things. Rita leaned against the bar, her expression serious. Eddie, I like you. You've always been straight with me, always paid your tab, never caused trouble. So I'm going to be straight with you. I took a sip of coffee that could have stripped paint and waited. Your wife's been coming in here Thursday nights for about 3 months, not alone. Lance Bishop. You know about him? I'm learning. What else should I know? Rita glanced around the empty bar, then leaned closer. They don't just drink and leave, Eddie. They sit in that corner booth, heads together, talking like they're planning something. And the way she looks at him, she shook her head. I've been married 3 times. I know what that look means. Anyone else seen them? Half the Thursday night crowd. Mike Kowalski, Danny Murphy, Sarah Chen, Julia's sister, works at the bank. Word is Lance has been throwing money around like it's going out of style. Expensive dinners, weekend trips, jewelry. More than his salary should cover. That was interesting. Lance made good money, but wealth management consultants in Millfield weren't exactly pulling down Wall Street bonuses. If he was spending big, either he was going into debt or he had money coming from somewhere else. Sarah mention anything specific? Just that he's been making some unusual transactions. Large cash withdrawals, payments to restaurants and hotels that don't match his normal spending pattern. She probably shouldn't have said anything, but she's worried about Julia getting mixed up in whatever's going on. I finished my coffee and left a 20 on the bar. Thanks, Rita. I owe you one. Eddie? She caught my arm as I turned to leave. Whatever you're thinking of doing, be smart about it. Men like Lance Bishop have connections. They play by different rules. So do I. The next stop was Big Mike Kowalski, my crew chief and the closest thing I had to a best friend. Mike was 6'4", 260 pounds of muscle and loyalty, with hands that could crush beer cans and a heart that was pure gold. He'd worked for me for 8 years, and I'd trust him with my life. I found him at the Peterson job site, installing crown molding with the precision of a surgeon. The house was a custom build in Millfield's historic district, the kind of project that kept my company in business and my reputation solid. "Boss," he said without looking up from his work, "heard you had some excitement last night." "You could say that. Need to ask you a favor, Mike." He set down his nail gun and gave me his full attention. Mike had been through a messy divorce 5 years ago, and he knew the signs. "What do you need?" "Information, and maybe a little help with a project." I told him what I'd discovered, what Rita had said, and what I suspected. Mike's expression grew darker with each detail. "That son of a jerk," he growled when I finished. "What do you want to do about it?" "Nothing illegal. Nothing that'll get us in trouble. But I want Lance Bishop to understand that actions have consequences." Mike grinned, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. "I might know a guy who knows a guy. What kind of consequences are we talking about?" "The kind that hurt his pride more than his body. The kind that make him think twice about messing with other people's lives." "I can work with that. Give me a day or two." That evening, I went home to find Mara in full damage control mode. She'd cooked dinner, something she hadn't done in months, and set the table with our good china. She'd changed into the blue dress I'd always liked, the one she'd worn on our first anniversary. "I thought we could have a nice dinner and talk," she said, her smile bright but brittle. "Just the two of us." "Like roommates do?" The smile faltered. "Eddie, please. I said I was sorry." I sat down across from her and looked at the meal she'd prepared. Pot roast, mashed potatoes, green beans, all my favorites. It was a good effort, but it was about 8 months too late. "How's Lance?" I asked, cutting into the meat. She nearly dropped her fork. "What?" "Lance Bishop. You know, from last night? He seemed like a nice guy, very concerned about our private conversation." I don't know what you mean." "Sure you do. You two seemed pretty friendly. How long have you known him?" Mara's face had gone pale, but she was trying to hold it together. "He's just someone from work, Eddie. He handles some of our accounts. Must be good at his job. Nice car, expensive clothes. Probably makes pretty good money." "I wouldn't know." I nodded and took another bite. The pot roast was actually pretty good. "This is nice, Mara. Very domestic. Very roommate-like." She set down her fork and looked at me across the table. "What do you want me to say, Eddie? That I'm sorry? I am. That it was a stupid joke? It was. That I love you? I do. Do you?" The question hung in the air between us like smoke. Mara opened her mouth to answer, then closed it again. For just a moment, I saw something real in her eyes. Guilt, maybe, or fear. "Of course I do," she said finally, but the words sounded hollow. "Good," I said, standing up and carrying my plate to the sink. "Because your roommate is going to be working late for the next few nights. Big project coming up." I left her sitting at the table and went down to my workshop. I had planning to do. Thursday night came with a cold October rain that turned the streets of Millfield into rivers of yellow light and dark shadows. I sat in my truck across from Rita's Tavern, watching the entrance and waiting. At 7:30, Lance's BMW pulled up to the curb, and I felt my jaw tighten as I watched my wife get out of the passenger seat. She was wearing the red coat I'd bought her for Christmas, and she was laughing at something Lance had said. They looked comfortable together, natural, like they'd done this 100 times before, which apparently they had. I waited until they were inside, then called Big Mike. "They're here," I said. "Give me 5 minutes." Mike had a friend named Tommy who worked at the city garage. Tommy owed Mike a favor from a poker game, and Mike had decided it was time to collect. What they were about to do wasn't technically illegal, more like creative interpretation of parking regulations. I watched through the tavern's windows as Mara and Lance settled into their usual corner booth. They were holding hands across the table, and Lance was leaning in close, whispering something that made her smile. It was the kind of smile she used to give me, back when we were first married and the world was full of possibilities. My phone buzzed with a text from Mike. Done. Give it an hour. An hour later, Mara and Lance came out of the tavern, still laughing, still touching, still acting like they were the only two people in the world. But their good mood disappeared fast when they saw what was waiting for them. Lance's BMW was completely boxed in by an enormous city garbage truck on one side and a road construction barrier on the other. There was maybe 6 inches of clearance on each side, not nearly enough to get out. I rolled down my window and listened as Lance started making phone calls, his voice getting louder and angrier with each conversation. The city garage was closed. The towing company was experiencing delays. The construction crew had apparently gone home for the night and wouldn't be back until morning. Mara was getting soaked in the rain, and her red coat was starting to look less elegant and more like a wet blanket. Lance was pacing back and forth, gesturing wildly at his trapped car, his expensive shoes splashing through puddles. Finally, they gave up and called a cab. I followed at a distance as it took them to Lance's downtown loft, and I watched from across the street as they went inside together. The lights in his apartment stayed on until well after midnight. I went home and slept better than I had in months. The next morning, I was having coffee in my kitchen when Mara came downstairs. She looked tired, and there was something different about her, a wariness that hadn't been there before. "How was your evening?" I asked, not looking up from my newspaper. "Fine. I went out with Julia and some friends from work." "That's nice. Where did you go?" "Just around. You know how it is." I nodded and turned the page. "I heard there was some excitement downtown last night, something about a car getting blocked in at Rita's place." Mara froze halfway to the coffee pot. "Oh?" "Yeah, some guy in a BMW. Apparently, the city had to do some emergency work on the street, and his car got trapped. Poor bastard had to take a cab home." She poured her coffee with hands that weren't quite steady. "That's unfortunate." I thought so too, especially since it's supposed to rain again tonight. And it did rain again, and the night after that. And every Thursday night for the next month, something seemed to happen to Lance Bishop's BMW. Sometimes it was city work. Sometimes it was a delivery truck that accidentally blocked the street. Once, it was a small flock of geese that had apparently decided to make the area around Rita's tavern their temporary home. Lance started parking farther and farther away, but somehow, Mike and his network of friends always seemed to find new ways to make his Thursday nights inconvenient. Nothing illegal, nothing that could be traced back to me, but enough to make the point that someone was watching. The real breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Mr. Daly, my 78-year-old neighbor, was a retired postal worker with too much time on his hands and an unnatural interest in other people's business. He spent most of his day sitting on his front porch, watching the neighborhood and keeping mental notes on everything that happened. "Eddie," he called to me one Saturday morning as I was working in my yard. "Got a minute?" I walked over to his fence and he motioned for me to come closer. "Been meaning to talk to you about something," he said in a voice that suggested conspiracy. "About your wife." "What about her?" "Well, I don't like to gossip, but I've been noticing some things, like how she's been getting picked up by that fancy car every Thursday afternoon, and how she doesn't come home until Friday morning." I kept my expression neutral. "Is that right?" "That's right. And yesterday, I saw her at the bank with that same fellow. They were in there for a long time talking to one of the managers. Looked like serious business." That was new information. What would Mara and Lance be doing at the bank together? "Thanks, Mr. Daly. I appreciate you looking out for me. Eddie, I've lived on this street for 40 years. I've seen marriages come and go, and I've learned to recognize the signs. Whatever's going on, you need to be careful. That wife of yours, she's up to something." I spent the rest of the weekend thinking about what Mr. Daly had said. What kind of business would Mara and Lance have at the bank? Our accounts were separate except for the joint checking account we used for household expenses. Mara made her own money and managed her own finances, unless she wasn't anymore. Monday morning, I called Sarah Chen at First National Bank. Sarah was Julia's sister, but she'd always been friendly to me, and she'd been the one to approve the loan for my business expansion 2 years ago. Eddie, good to hear from you. What can I do for you? Sarah, I need to ask you about something, and I need you to be straight with me. Has Mara been in there recently? Maybe with someone else? There was a long pause. Eddie, you know I can't discuss other people's banking business. I'm not asking about other people. I'm asking about my wife. Another pause. She came in last week with a man I didn't recognize. They were asking about refinancing options for your house. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Refinancing? I shouldn't be telling you this, but Eddie, they wanted to know about taking out a second mortgage, a big one. I told them they'd need both signatures on the paperwork, but they seemed to think that wouldn't be a problem. I thanked Sarah and hung up, my mind racing. Mara and Lance weren't just having an affair, they were planning to steal my house out from under me. The house I'd bought, renovated, and paid for with my own sweat. That changed everything. The confrontation came on a Tuesday night, 2 weeks after my conversation with Sarah. I'd been patient, gathering information, building my case, but the second mortgage attempt had pushed me past the point of careful planning. It was time for direct action. Mara was in the living room, laptop open, supposedly working on a presentation for work. But I'd been watching her screen from the kitchen, and she wasn't working on anything related to TechFlow solutions. She was browsing real estate websites, looking at condos in Portland and Boston, places that would cost a fortune and were way beyond what we could afford on our current income. Unless she was planning to use my house as collateral. Find anything interesting? I asked, walking into the room with 2 cups of coffee. She quickly closed the laptop. Just work stuff. You know how it is. Actually, I don't. Why don't you tell me how it is? Something in my tone made her look up sharply. What do you mean? I sat down across from her and set both cups on the coffee table. I mean, tell me about your work. Tell me about Lance Bishop. Tell me about the bank. The color drained from her face. Eddie, I don't know what you think you know, but I know you've been sleeping with him for months. I know you've been spending Thursday nights at his apartment. I know you went to the bank together to ask about refinancing our house. Our house, Mara. The house I bought and paid for. She was quiet for a long moment, and I could see her mind working, trying to figure out how much I knew and how much I was guessing. It's not what you think, she said finally. Then explain it to me. Lance and we're friends. Close friends. And yes, maybe it's become something more, but it's not about the money, Eddie. It's about being with someone who understands me, who sees my potential, who wants the same things I want. And what things are those? A better life. A life where I don't have to worry about money, where I can travel and experience things and be around people who appreciate culture and sophistication. Lance can give me that. I nodded slowly. With my house as collateral. The house is it's an investment, Eddie. We could use the equity to start fresh, both of us. You could start a new business, maybe in a different city. I could pursue opportunities that I can't hear. Opportunities with Lance. Maybe. I don't know yet. But I know I can't keep living like this, pretending to be happy with a life that feels too small for me. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the street where I'd lived for 8 years, where I'd built a life and a business and a reputation, where I'd thought I was building a future with the woman I loved. When were you going to tell me? I asked. I was trying to figure out how. I didn't want to hurt you, Eddie, I really didn't. But I can't keep pretending anymore. I turned back to face her. So the roommate comment wasn't a joke. No, it wasn't. At least she was being honest now. I had to give her credit for that. Okay, I said. I appreciate the honesty. Now let me be honest with you. I pulled out my phone and showed her the screenshots I'd taken weeks ago, the text messages, the photos, the evidence of her affair with Lance. Her eyes went wide as she realized how much I knew and how long I'd known it. "You've been planning this for a while," she said. "Just like you have. The difference is, you were planning to steal from me. I'm just planning to protect myself. What do you want, Eddie?" "I want you to call Lance and tell him the refinancing is off. I want you to decide whether you want to try to save our marriage or end it cleanly. And I want you to understand that if you try to screw me over financially, I'll make sure everyone in this town knows exactly what kind of person you are." Mara's expression hardened. "You're threatening me?" "I'm informing you. There's a difference." She stood up and grabbed her purse and keys. "I need some air. I need to think." "Take all the time you need, but Mara, when you come back I want an answer." She left without another word, and I heard her car pull out of the driveway. I knew where she was going, straight to Lance's apartment to figure out their next move. I was counting on it. While Mara was gone, I made some calls. The first was to my lawyer, Tom Harrison, who'd handled my business incorporation and would handle my divorce if it came to that. The second was to my accountant, who helped me understand exactly what assets were in my name, what was in Mara's, and what was joint property. The third call was to Big Mike. "Time for phase 2, I told him. "What do you need?" "I need Lance Bishop to understand that he's messing with the wrong family." "How far do you want to take it?" "Far enough to make the point, not far enough to get arrested." Mike chuckled. "I'll make some calls." The next morning, Lance's BMW wouldn't start. The battery was over, and when he called for a jump, the mechanic discovered that someone had loosened the battery cables just enough to cause problems, but not enough to cause permanent damage. The day after that, his credit card was declined at lunch. Apparently, there had been some unusual activity on his account, and the bank had frozen it as a security precaution. It took him 3 hours and a trip to the bank to get it sorted out. The day after that, his apartment building's elevator broke down, stranding him on the 8th floor. The repair company was experiencing delays and couldn't get there until the next day. None of these things were serious, none of them were illegal, but they were annoying, inconvenient, and clearly targeted. Lance Bishop was starting to understand that someone was watching him, someone who could make his life difficult in small but persistent ways, and that was just the beginning. The showdown I'd been expecting came on a Friday night at Rita's Tavern. I was having a beer with Mike and Danny Murphy, talking about the Peterson job and trying to act normal, when Lance Bishop walked through the door. He looked around the bar until he spotted me, then walked straight over to our table. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his expensive shirt was wrinkled, and there was something wild in his eyes. "We need to talk," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "I don't think we do," I replied, not bothering to stand up. "But you're welcome to buy a round and join the conversation." "Cut the bullshit, Forrest. I know what you've been doing." The bar had gone quiet. Rita was polishing glasses behind the counter, but I could tell she was listening. Danny and Mike flanked me like bodyguards, and I could feel the tension building. "I've been working," I said. "Building things, creating value, productive activities. What have you been doing, Lance?" "You know damn well what I've been doing, and you know why I'm here." I took a sip of my beer and studied his face. "Actually, I don't. Why don't you enlighten me?" Lance leaned forward, his hands flat on the table. "Your wife is leaving you. She's going to file for divorce, and she's going to take half of everything you own. Fighting it won't change anything except make you look pathetic." "Is that what she told you?" "That's what's going to happen." I nodded thoughtfully. "And then what? You two ride off into the sunset together? Live happily ever after on my money?" "What Mara and I do is none of your business." "Actually, it is my business. She's still my wife. And you're still the guy who's been screwing around with another man's wife for months." Lance straightened up, his face flushing red. "You don't deserve her. You never did. She's smart, ambitious, sophisticated. She needs someone who can match her intelligence, someone who can give her the life she deserves. Someone like you? Someone exactly like me. I stood up slowly, and Mike and Danny stood with me. Lance was tall, but he was soft. The kind of guy who got his exercise at an expensive gym and had never done a day of real physical work in his life. Mike was 6 inches taller and 100 pounds heavier, and Danny had the kind of scars that came from bar fights and construction accidents. "Let me explain something to you, Lance," I said, my voice quiet but carrying clearly through the silent bar. "I don't care if Mara wants to leave me. If she's not happy, if she thinks she can do better, that's her choice. But if you think you're going to steal my house, my business, or anything else I've worked for, you're going to learn why that's a bad idea." "You're threatening me?" "I'm educating you. See, you live in a world where problems get solved with phone calls and lawyers and money. I live in a world where problems get solved with tools and sweat, and sometimes with fists. You've been playing games with my life for months, thinking there wouldn't be consequences. Now you're finding out different." Lance looked around the bar, taking in the faces watching him. These weren't his people. They were mine. Blue-collar workers who'd known me for years, who'd seen me build my business from nothing, who understood loyalty and respect and the difference between right and wrong. "This isn't over," he said. "No," I agreed. "It's not, but it will be soon." Lance turned and walked out, and the normal noise of the bar gradually resumed. But I could feel the change in the atmosphere. Word would spread from here to every job site, every diner, every corner of Millfield's working-class community. Eddie Forrest was fighting back, and people were choosing sides. Mike clapped me on the shoulder. "That felt good, didn't it?" "It felt necessary." "What's next?" "Now we wait and see what they do." I didn't have to wait long. The next morning, Mara was gone. Her clothes, her jewelry, her personal items, all of it packed up and moved out while I was at the Peterson job site. She'd left a note on the kitchen counter. "Eddie, I'm sorry it had to end this way, but we both know this marriage has been over for a long time. I'll be staying with friends while I figure out my next steps. My lawyer will be in touch about the divorce proceedings. I hope we can handle this like adults and avoid making it any messier than it has to be. Mara." I read the note twice, then crumpled it up and threw it in the trash. After 8 years of marriage, that was what I got. A form letter that could have been written to any husband by any wife who decided to trade up. But there was something else on the counter that interested me more. Mail that had arrived that morning, including a credit card statement for an account I didn't know Mara had. I opened it, figuring I had a right to know what kind of debt she might be leaving me with. What I found was worse than debt. The statement showed charges going back 6 months. Expensive restaurants, luxury hotels, jewelry stores, clothing boutiques. Thousands of dollars in charges, all paid off each month with payments that came from an account I didn't recognize. Lance had been bankrolling Mara's lifestyle for months, turning her into his kept woman while she was still married to me. And now they thought they could use my house to pay for their future together. I called Tom Harrison and made an appointment for Monday morning. Then I called Mike and told him it was time for the final phase. "How final are we talking?" he asked. "Final enough that Lance Bishop will never forget the name Eddie Forrest. I'll make the arrangements." The plan came together over the weekend. Mike had connections throughout the city, guys who worked for the power company, the phone company, the cable company, the city maintenance department, guys who understood that sometimes the system needed a little adjustment, that sometimes people who thought they were above consequences needed to be reminded that they weren't. Monday morning, I met with Tom Harrison and laid out everything I knew. The affair, the financial manipulation, the attempted refinancing, the credit card statements. Tom was a good lawyer, the kind who'd grown up in Millfield and understood how things worked in a small town. "This is solid, Eddie," he said after reviewing the evidence. "If Mara tries to claim half the house, we can fight it. The affair won't matter much legally, but the financial deception will. And if she's been using marital assets to fund her relationship with Bishop, we can make a case for reimbursement. What about the refinancing attempt? That's attempted fraud. She can't refinance property that's solely in your name without your signature, and any attempt to forge your signature would be a felony. I don't think she'll go that far, but if she does, we'll have her. Good. Now let me tell you what else I'm planning. I laid out the scheme Mike and I had developed. Tom listened without comment, occasionally making notes, his expression growing more amused as I went into detail. Eddie, he said when I finished, I can't officially condone any of this, but unofficially, it's brilliant, and as far as I can tell, it's completely legal. That's what I was hoping you'd say. Tuesday morning, Lance Bishop's day started going wrong early. His alarm didn't go off because his power had gone out during the night. Apparently, a tree branch had fallen on the power line serving his building, and the repair crew was experiencing delays. When he tried to call his office, his cell phone was over. The battery had drained overnight for some reason, and his charger wasn't working. When he tried to use his landline, he discovered that his phone service had been disconnected due to a billing error that would take several hours to resolve. His BMW was in the parking garage, but the garage door was stuck. The electronic opener had malfunctioned, and the manual override was temporarily out of order. The building maintenance crew was on their way, but couldn't give him an estimated arrival time. By the time Lance finally made it to his office, 3 hours late and in a cab that cost him $60, he found a message waiting for him. Pinnacle Wealth Management had received an anonymous tip about irregularities in his handling of client accounts, and he was being placed on administrative leave pending an investigation. The investigation would eventually clear him. Lance was a lot of things, but he wasn't stupid enough to steal from clients. But the process would take weeks, and in the meantime, his reputation would be damaged and his income would be cut off. While Lance was dealing with his professional crisis, Mara was having problems of her own. She'd moved into a downtown apartment that Lance was paying for, but somehow the lease had gotten mixed up. According to the property management company, there had been a clerical error, and the apartment had been double-booked. She'd have to move out immediately while they sorted things out. Her credit cards were also having issues. Apparently, there had been suspicious activity on her accounts, and the banks had frozen them as a security precaution. It would take several days to resolve, and in the meantime, she had no access to her money. At TechFlow Solutions, Mara's boss had received an anonymous email containing detailed information about her affair with Lance, including copies of text messages and photos. While the company couldn't fire her for her personal life, they could, and did, reassign her to a position with less responsibility and lower pay, citing concerns about professional judgment. By Wednesday, both Mara and Lance were starting to understand that their problems weren't coincidental. Someone was systematically dismantling their lives piece by piece in ways that were perfectly legal but incredibly effective. Thursday morning, Lance showed up at my job site. I was installing trim in the Peterson house's master bedroom when Mike came to find me. "Boss, you've got a visitor." And he doesn't look happy. Lance was standing next to his BMW in the driveway, and he looked like he hadn't slept in days. His usually perfect appearance was disheveled, his expensive clothes were wrinkled, and there was a desperate edge to his eyes. "Forrest!" he called when he saw me. "We need to talk." I walked over to him slowly, Mike and 2 other crew members flanking me. "What can I do for you, Lance?" "You can stop this. Whatever you're doing, whatever game you're playing, it ends now." "I'm not playing any games. I'm working. This is what work looks like." "Cut the bullshit. I know you're behind everything that's been happening. The power outages, the phone problems, the apartment mix-up, the investigation at my office. I know it's you." "That's a serious accusation. You have any proof?" Lance's face was red with anger and frustration. "I don't need proof. I know." "Well, knowing and proving are 2 different things. But let's say, hypothetically, that someone was making your life difficult. What would you want to do about it? I want it to stop. And what are you willing to do to make it stop? Lance looked around at the crew members watching him, then back at me. What do you want? I want you to stay away from my wife. I want you to stop trying to steal my house. And I want you to understand that actions have consequences. Mara's not your wife anymore. She's filing for divorce. Until those papers are signed, she's still my wife. And even after they're signed, my house is still my house. She's entitled to half of everything. She's entitled to what the law says she's entitled to, which given the circumstances might not be as much as you think. Lance stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him trying to calculate his options. He was used to winning through money and connections, but those tools weren't working here. This was my town, my territory, my rules. This isn't over, he said finally. Yes, it is. You just don't know it yet. He got in his car and drove away, but I knew he'd be back. Men like Lance didn't give up easily, especially when they thought they were smarter than everyone else. I was counting on it. The end came on a Friday afternoon in November, exactly 6 weeks after Mara had introduced me as her roommate at the country club. I was in my workshop, putting the finishing touches on a custom cabinet for the Peterson job, when my phone rang. Eddie, it's Tom. You need to get down to my office right now. What's wrong? Just get here and bring everything we talked about. I drove to Tom's office in the center of town, my mind racing through possibilities. When I arrived, I found Tom waiting for me with a grim expression and a stack of papers on his desk. Mara's filed for divorce, he said without preamble, and she's claiming half of everything, including the house. We expected that. There's more. She's also claiming that you've been harassing her and Lance Bishop. She wants a restraining order, and she's threatening to press charges for stalking and intimidation. I sat down heavily in the chair across from his desk. Can she make it stick? Probably not, but she can make your life hell trying. And there's something else. Lance Bishop has filed a complaint with the police, claiming that you've been orchestrating a campaign of harassment against him. He doesn't have proof, but he's got a list of incidents that would be hard to explain as coincidence. What do you think? Tom leaned back in his chair and studied me. I think you've been very clever, Eddie, but I also think you're about to find out whether you've been clever enough. That afternoon, I got a call from Detective Ray Sullivan of the Millfield Police Department. Ray and I had gone to high school together, and he'd hired me to build a deck on his house 3 years ago. He was a good cop and a fair man, but he had a job to do. Eddie, I need you to come in and answer some questions. Lance Bishop has filed a complaint, and I have to follow up on it. Am I under arrest? No, but I'd recommend bringing a lawyer. I called Tom, and we met at the police station an hour later. Ray had a file full of reports, the power outages, the phone problems, the apartment mix-up, the investigation at Lance's office. Individually, they looked like random bad luck. Together, they formed a pattern. Eddie, I'll be straight with you, Ray said. I can't prove you did any of this. Hell, I'm not even sure what crime you'd be charged with if you did do it. But Bishop is convinced you're behind it, and he's got some influential friends who are putting pressure on the department to do something. What kind of something? They want me to arrest you for harassment and intimidation. They want to make an example of you. Tom leaned forward. What's your recommendation, Ray? My recommendation is that Eddie stays away from both Bishop and his wife until this divorce is finalized. No contact, no games, no clever schemes. Just let the lawyers handle it. I nodded. I can do that. Good, because if anything else happens to Bishop, anything at all, you're going to be the first person I come looking for. We left the police station, and Tom drove me back to my truck. You need to be careful, Eddie. They're watching you now. I know. But it doesn't matter. The damage is already done. What do you mean? I smiled for the first time in weeks. Lance Bishop's reputation is shot. His job is gone. His credibility is destroyed. and everyone in town knows he's the kind of man who steals other people's wives. Mara's not much better off. Her career is stalled, her friends are talking behind her back, and she's financially dependent on a man who can barely take care of himself. And you? I'm exactly where I started. I've got my house, my business, my reputation, and my self-respect. They've got each other, and that's about all they've got. Tom nodded slowly. Sometimes the best revenge is just letting people destroy themselves. Sometimes. But other times, they need a little help. The final act played out over the next 2 months. The divorce proceedings were contentious but brief. Mara's affair and financial deception limited her claims significantly, and she ended up with far less than she'd expected. Lance's investigation was eventually closed, but the damage to his reputation was permanent. He left Millfield in January, taking a job with a smaller firm in a different state. Mara stayed in town, but her life had changed dramatically. Her job at TechFlow had been eliminated in a restructuring, and she was working as a receptionist at a dental office. Her downtown apartment had been replaced by a studio in a less fashionable part of town. Her designer clothes had been sold to pay for legal fees. I saw her occasionally around town, but we didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. One evening in March, almost 6 months after the country club party, I was having a beer at Rita's when she came over to my table. "You know," she said, sitting down across from me, "I never did thank you for the entertainment." "What entertainment?" "Watching Lance Bishop learn that money can't solve every problem. Watching Mara Forrest discover that trading up isn't always possible. It was better than cable TV." I raised my beer in a mock toast. Glad I could provide some amusement. "You did more than that, Eddie. You reminded people in this town that actions have consequences, that you can't just walk all over decent people and expect to get away with it. I just protected what was mine. You did more than that. You showed everyone that sometimes the good guys win." I finished my beer and stood up to leave. "Rita, the good guys don't always win. But sometimes, if they're smart enough and patient enough and angry enough, they don't lose either." As I walked out of Rita's tavern and into the cool Maine evening, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: complete satisfaction. Mara had called me her roommate, had tried to steal my house, had planned to destroy my life for her own convenience. Instead, she'd learned that some roommates don't just split the bills, they settle them.